guys ready? Great. Are you ready? Good afternoon and welcome to the lecture, Mission Possible, Emergency Response for Cultural Heritage Institutions in Puerto Rico. This event is co-sponsored by the NARA Assembly and NARA Preservation Programs. My name is Shannon Kerner, co-chair of the National Archives Assembly Preservation Committee and a conservator here at NARA. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Assembly, the National Archives Assembly is an organization of present and former NARA employees who support the development of NARA as the leading archival institution in the world. The Assembly provides a forum for employee communication on NARA policy and programs. The Assembly also serves to convey its members' views to the Archivist of the United States. For those interested in joining or renewing their membership forms are available and the Assembly can be contacted on the internal NARA ICN. Dues go, in part, to support programs like this, Archives Week participation, and the National History Day Awards. We have a number of accomplished speakers here today, and in the order that you will see them appear. Jennifer Groman is the Facilities Engineering Chief at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in charge of NASA's construction and maintenance programs, trained as a historical architect at the University of Texas and Yale University. Jennifer worked for several years as Deputy Federal Preservation Officer and Cultural Resources Program Manager for the Army, as well as Federal Preservation Officer for NASA. Jennifer has worked overseas developing cultural resources programs in Mexico, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia. Jennifer responded to the call for federal volunteers to support FEMA after the onslaught of hurricanes in 2017 and was deployed to support FEMA in Puerto Rico. Beatriz Centeno Pinheiro is a senior conservator at the National Archives and a professional associate member of the American Institute for Conservation. A native of Puerto Rico, Beatriz gained experience working in conservation labs in private practice and at the Museum of Art of Puerto Rico for about 10 years before pursuing a professional degree. In 2011, she obtained her MA and Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from Buffalo State College. During graduate school, she interned at the National Gallery of Art and at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. She later worked as the Associate Paper Conservator at the Brooklyn Museum in New York after 3 years as the Mellon Fellow. After joining the archives in 2017, Beatrice was deployed on the ESF-11 mission assignment to Puerto Rico to help the hurricane recovery efforts. Nora Lokshin is the Senior Conservator at the Smithsonian Institution Archives, leading the collections care team of conservation and preservation, providing treatment and consultation for fellow archives and special collections within the Smithsonian community. With Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and FEMA, she has served in Haiti, the southeastern United States, and Puerto Rico. She serves on the Pan-Institutional Preparedness and Response in Collections Emergency Team, sits on the Smithsonian Institution Emergency Management Advisory Committee, and is a steering committee member for the DC Alliance for Response. She is a professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation, chapter officer for the Guild of Bookworkers, Potomac chapter, and Washington Conservation Guild member. Abigail Aldrich is a supervisory conservator in conservation RXC based at Archives 2 here at NARA. Abigail trained as an objects conservator in London, England, receiving her MA and Masters of Science from the Institute of Archaeology at the University College London. While living in the United Kingdom, she worked at the British Museum, the Science Museum, and the Tate, where she served as the Senior Advisory Sculpture Conservator. Since moving to the Washington area, Abigail has worked at the National Park Service and at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where she was the exhibits conservator. From January of 2017, Abigail worked as NARA's exhibits conservator based at Archives 1. In addition to her work at the National Archives, Abigail is also on the board of the Washington Conservation Guild. Vicki Lee is a senior conservator in Conservation RXC based at Archives 2 here at NARA. Vicki trained as a book conservator at the North Bennett Street School in Boston, Massachusetts. She has worked at the Missouri Botanical Garden and Emory University Woodruff Library. Before coming to NARA, she was the Director of Conservation at the Maryland State Archives. Vicki has been a National Heritage Responder through the Foundation of American Institute for Conservation since 2008. She has responded to the Cedar River flood, the collapse of the Cologne State Archives, the Haitian earthquake, Hurricane Sandy and Maria, and various much smaller in-house emergencies. Preston Huff, who will be joining us on the phone later, has been with NARA for over 15 years and is currently in the office of the Chief Records Officer. Previous to his current role, Preston was NARA's regional administrator for the Southwest region and oversaw the three main areas of the region, including the regional archives, records management, and the Federal Records Center. One of his ongoing areas of responsibilities include disaster response, recovery, and reconstitution for federal records and information. He recently led a NARA working group in overhauling the federal government's Essential Records Guide. Preston has a BA in U.S. History from Indiana University and an MLS from the University of Denver with a concentration in archival studies. He is a certified records manager and a certified archivist. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to start our presentation.
Thank you, Shannon. Really appreciate the introductions for the team, and I'll just figure out if I know how to drive first. Okie dokie. Well, again, thank you all for being here today and on the line. We're here to present the case. It's like a case study, but our experiences in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. To give you a little bit of a context, in my description, I'm a cultural resources specialist. I happen to be working as an architect now at NASA, but my background had been in historic preservation for many years. Never working in the emergency response world, though. I heard the call to arms, so to speak, after the hurricanes, so that's how I got involved. It's the Isla del Encanto. I'm bilingual in Spanish. I grew up in Latin America. And I'm going to give you the context for the other speakers today, putting you in the sense of where we were last fall, and that's kind of where we're going to, and then they'll continue with what the work they did as a team on the ground. I want to take you back to August 25th for a moment. Hurricane Harvey made landfall, Category 4, in Houston. It stayed over Houston for several days, and therefore all the rain that accumulated was mainly because it stayed stationary. FEMA responded to that hurricane, and within a few days they realized that they were going to need more people to help. Soon after, less than 2 weeks later, Irma hit. Now, Irma hit the Virgin Islands first as a Category 5 hurricane. I want to remind people of the intensity of these storms. And then it proceeded to hit the east coast of Puerto Rico. Maria came 2 weeks later and hit the east coast and proceeded across the island. Now, what is the type of devastation that hits in a Category 4 or 5, and Maria hit as a 4? I would ask for a show of hands, but it's a little awkward, so picture a tornado-stricken location. Category 4s and 5s knocked down practically all of the trees of the Virgin Islands in Puerto Rico. When I flew into Puerto Rico during the emergency, it was like pixie sticks on the ground. There wasn't a tree standing. And that means that any wood structures on the islands were pretty much devastated and lost. The only surviving structures were masonry. So I just want to give you that context of where we were in the fall when 3 hurricanes hit within 6 weeks of each other. This is the trajectory of Maria. It hit the east coast of the island, right about, it's south of where Irma had hit, but still on the east coast. After Irma, 1 million people were without power. And then at the end of the trajectory of Maria, the entire island was without power. I also want to give you a context of the power situation in Puerto Rico. I am sure you've heard the news about the power. Just to give you a context for that for a moment, the 2 main power lines for the island, the power stations are on the south, and 2 main transmission lines go from the south to the north across the middle of the island. They were wiped out entirely. The only remaining grid that could exist afterwards is a tiny, makeshift, early ages grid of electricity that goes around the island. So picture there was no electricity. There were none of those big transmission lines anymore. The power plants are on the south. San Juan is on the north. There's no way to get power to San Juan without rebuilding the power lines from the south. And then as they're rebuilding, it's still the makeshift power lines that they were able to get back in place. So it's an important context because you hear still on the news those without power. It's because the transmission lines in Puerto Rico are gone. And the next wave of storms will pretty much likely, if one hits again, wipe out the small infrastructure that is left. So it's important to understand that the power is a big part of it, because what do we rely on most to maintain the relative humidity in the collections? And I just wanted to give you that context. So here are a few images of what was on the ground after Maria. At least 24 to 26 bridges were wiped out entirely within the 12 hours of Maria. Whole communities were left without access. Landslides everywhere. Houses, which were not necessarily the best construction techniques. A lot of them were built by hand by the owners themselves. And essentially, whole areas of the island were devastated, and not to mention the power lines I said before. If you weren't aware of it, back in September, early September, there was a call for surge capacity. FEMA has, under the Department of Homeland Security, they have an ability to call up other federal workers. The line of call up is first all FEMA employees. They're organized by region, so the region that has that location first gets itself called up, then other regions who aren't affected will be called up. So the region for Puerto Rico is actually New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and they had Sandy's experience. So there were a lot of experienced FEMA workers who were associated with this region who got called down to Puerto Rico. When FEMA had Harvey as well, then Irma followed quickly after. Their capacity within their in-house ran out pretty quickly, so they were then calling upon Department of Homeland Security employees. They then ran out of those, and they called out the federal workforce. That's Tier 3. So a call went out to all agencies in late August and early September for any volunteer employees to come and help FEMA out. So I ignored the email, like everybody else, and then Maria hit. And then because I'm bilingual, I said, I always wanted to help after Katrina, and I never got the chance, so maybe I should raise my hand. My agency had already had 200 volunteers and said there wasn't any more room for me. So thank you very much. You're not needed. And then I said, by the way, I'm a historic preservation and cultural resources expert, and I'm bilingual in Spanish. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, you might be needed. So the way it works is that you get called up, your agency pays your salary during this time, and FEMA pays your travel. And so we went to training in Anniston, Alabama for a few days, and then when I volunteered, I didn't know where I was going, but I did want to go to Puerto Rico. I contacted my friend who was the environmental director and historic preservation director for FEMA, and couldn't get a hold of her. Imagine she might have been a little busy. And she saw my post on Facebook when Hurricane Nate came along. Did you remember Hurricane Nate came? Fastest moving cyclone in the 2017 season. It prevented any of us getting to Anniston because it was hitting the Alabama coast. And she saw my post on Facebook that said, I'm ready to go help FEMA, but I can't get there yet. And she said, you're going? And I said, yes. And she goes, I need you. And I said, where? And she said, Puerto Rico. And I said, good, I speak Spanish. So I was deployed to Puerto Rico, and this picture on the right is the joint field office, and this is at the convention center in San Juan. So they took over the entire convention center. The ground floor was used for the Army and our somewhat barracks as we arrived in the cots. You then got moved to a ship or a hotel, but there weren't very many hotels, so most people got placed on ships. Navy ships with 3 bunks each, or on a ferry. And these are the offices. This is our office in the convention center in one of the ballrooms. The mission that I was given was the Heritage and Emergency National Task Force. As soon as I landed on the ground in Puerto Rico, I was assigned to this group, a group of one, me. And essentially, and then I was told, really what your job is to do is try and save the collections. I said, what are those, so to speak? And they said, the archives, that which is document collections, the museum collections, all types of museums, not just art, but the artifacts and such, as well as the libraries and the cultural sites, historic buildings. Now remember the devastation of the island, totally wiped out, and the electricity and the many roads and roofs and such. So it was a pretty daunting task to try to figure out how to prioritize. I had never had the experience of working in emergency before. So, but really the intent of it was to focus on the things that needed saving and helping. And the pictures in here to the far right are art collections that were affected immediately by mildew and mold. Theaters, totally wet and saturated. A theater like this, totally saturated with water. Roofs on buildings, totally broken. And then library collections, artwork like tapestries over on the left, and old forts. So that's just a sample of the types of sites that we had to work on and the conditions. Most importantly is to understand that there wasn't any light, so when you would go into these places, you had your phones, and that was it. The Army had set up generators at the convention center, and that's where we were powering our phones and everything. Part of the effort that I kicked off with was trying to meet the people who had damaged collections and such, and there were all types, from the Museum of the Americas, which has wooden and artifacts. It had old hand-carved santos or feather artifacts, all types of paper artifacts, and then and the artworks of several of the museums. Fortunately, private museums did fairly well. They had generators that were running and were able to maintain relative humidity in many of their galleries. Then there were those smaller private collections that had no generator backup. And that was probably the biggest challenge. Under FEMA, you could request for assistance for fuel or generators. The moment the hurricane hit, within a few hours, the Corps of Engineers took possession of all fuel on the island to ration it, and for hospitals and such that needed first responders. So the museums who might have had fuel coming in and weren't able to fill up their tanks before the hurricane because everybody was rushing to get ready, might have had only half a tank and were then unable to get fuel for a while. So it wasn't necessarily, even if they were prepared and had emergency plans, it still wasn't exactly tweaked to the right nth degree to understand what they really needed to do to be prepared. Plane on a Stick, as we call them, that's at the National Guard Museum. So one of the first things I did was meet with the conservators across the island. There's a photo of us meeting at the Museum of Art, which had electricity, and trying to understand what different skill sets were with the conservators and what they had, whether we had paper, painting, and such, and then figure out what our gaps were. I think some mention was made of the heritage responders who were eager to volunteer from across the nation, but yet we weren't sure where to bring them in and who to bring them into, because we didn't really want people arriving in the middle of the mayhem without some sort of plan. And so really my job at the beginning was to try to get plans in place and meet with people and get everybody organized. And most importantly, what I was trying to do was make sure that they were prepared for the next disaster. That was my biggest concern, is that they were reacting immediately for this disaster, but they needed to understand seasons would come and they needed to be ready and to work together. They were all working as independent organizations, whether they were the public organizations and or the private. And the Institute of Culture of Puerto Rico did a lot of leading in this place, as well as did the Museum of Art of Puerto Rico, lending their expertise. So we created 3 task forces, one for the conservators, one for archivists, and one for museums. And luckily for me, there were a lot of people who stepped up to lead in those occasions and to take the reins, because what essentially I said is, I'm here for 45 days. When I leave, there will be no one running this. You need to run yourselves. So getting them together to organize themselves and lead themselves was pretty much what I considered my part of my key mission. In these pictures, these are just meetings with different groups. The top left is the archivists from around the island. On the bottom left is the director of the General Archives, Dr. Samuel Quiñones and his team. Middle picture is a group of native Puerto Ricans, the Taínos. This is the Institute of Culture, that's drawing collection that got soaked. And the Taínos Cultural Center, which was wiped out similar to a tornado. One of the key objectives while I was there, though, was to focus on the General Archives and Library. This building was generally prepared for emergencies. It had a 2-megawatt generator. I didn't know anything much about generators until I got down there and learned to fight for generators for every institution that needed one. But a 2-megawatt generator is pretty dang big, and it's the size that all the hospitals needed. So where do you think we came on the list of priorities? We weren't as high. So in due time, however, we lucked out. We did acquire a generator, not that size. What I did is I brought in some experts on electrical from the Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power, who were on loan to Puerto Rico, and got them to tell me what combination of sizes of generators would I need to help the General Archives. The reason being is that there was a film collection there that had a lot of condensation on the outside of the film cans. The legal documents of the entire island are generally housed there. That means all property transactions, whether personal property, real estate, and business, as well as other important documents, and obviously the historical documents of the island were in the archives. So it was one of my greatest priorities, and we worked with the Corps of Engineers and were able to break up the power for the different sections of the building. But when we did finally get a generator for them, we could not put the lights on. I said, I don't care about the lights. You're not working in the dark anyway. I just need it in the collections. I need you to get air conditioning on in those collections, and you can live without the electricity for your day-to-day working. So they were, luckily the archives is a lovely old building that has passageways that are, and courtyards, so that it has a lot of natural light, obviously not in the stack, so to speak. But so we prioritized where the loads of the building would be to rescue as much as we could. But bearing in mind that the photo that you're seeing to the top right is the mold growing on the wood in the library room, in the reading room. And the books below are starting to show mold and mildew signs. And I won't use the right terminology because they're the conservators and I am not. I'm an architect. But those were the greatest concerns. And it had already been identified before I even got there that help was going to be needed. And that's when they turned towards a mission assignment to the national, the team of agencies who step up in these occasions, of which these are experts who came along. And it took us over a month to get it organized. A lot of people working behind the scenes trying to get the group organized to come down and who would volunteer and what was the expertise we needed. But paper conservators were paramount, collection conservators as well. And that's when this essentially sets the scene for the team who arrived to help on the ground. Much of what was done, you see in these pictures, you'll see some of these pictures repeated throughout our talk today, but the far right one I want to explain is that's a collection that was housed in a tractor trailer. And Viggy will explain a little bit more, but you can see that we're working without light in most cases, and we brought our own headlamps or flashlights to understand the conditions. And quickly we realized that what really needed to be done was that we needed to impart to the locals the knowledge that would help them help themselves, and that experts could not be brought in at a constant flow. Neither was there the funds nor the ability nor the time for people to spend half of their career helping pull up the situation in Puerto Rico. everybody in Puerto Rico is very resilient. It's amazing. If you want to think about it, they were living without electricity in their own homes and then still going to work. Okay, and then this was month upon month upon month. And keeping their spirits up and their attitudes was amazing. Such a resilient group. And then trying to solve the problems of the collections that they were the caretakers for in a situation. Now, I had worked in third world countries before, so it was very similar in the conditions where you don't even have electricity and you're trying to save collections. So one of the things that brought to our attention was that the standards that we have for maintaining collections isn't necessarily in the set to the standards that are needed to be followed and understood in a situation when you might not have electricity and in high humidity locations. So that's some of the stuff that they started to bring into the equation and all. So that pretty much sets the stage, I hope, for the team to follow me. We were just talking about this photo. On my one day off in 45 days, there was a stormy day, and I waited. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a full rainbow there. And I knew there might be an opportunity, so I just sat there waiting for this rainbow to show up. But that was kind of my attitude towards the island in general, was that the resiliency of the people of Puerto Rico and the efforts that they were putting into their own recovery was phenomenal, and the positive attitude in general up to when we were there was tremendous, and this is why I say it was looking brighter every day. They'll continue to tell you the story. It's not entirely still bright because of the economic situation of the island has always been part of the challenge. So when you're a bankrupt island and still trying to figure out how to do recovery, while FEMA is there to assist, it can't make up for the situations of some of their budgets and everything. So with that, I pass it on to Bea. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. That was my first experience also, being deployed and participating in a recovery situation. Prior to our deployment, we learned about a multi-agency effort to gather supplies for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The National Archives contributed by collecting items that could be used during the salvage efforts at both places. We first made arrangements for a pallet to be sent to Puerto Rico, and it arrived at the Archivo General between our first and second deployment. Since supplies and materials were scarce in Puerto Rico, one of our primary goals was to pack everything we could in our bags to either use or distribute amongst cultural institutions. That included the Spanish version of the Heritage Preservation Disaster Response Wheels on the right. Vicky, Nora, Diana, and I arrived in Puerto Rico on Sunday, November 12th. Jennifer met us at the airport, and since there was no power in many areas outside San Juan, and within San Juan the power was still very unstable, we decided to do a brief recognition tour of all San Juan before nightfall. Jennifer filled us in, and we later had our lodging assigned at the FEMA Joint Field Office, and we stayed that week at the Italian cruise ferry La Suprema on the right. Before coming up with the recovery strategies for the cultural institutions, the working conditions at the extent of the damage to the collections had to be assessed. So we intentionally set up a very vague plan for the week. The communication to arrange the visits was still very challenging, but Jennifer still succeeded to schedule visits. We eventually decided to divide ourselves into groups of 2 or more just to cover more ground and reach out and help more people. And at the end of the trip, we visited and provided support to 9 institutions, and I will speak about them in chronological order. We started off at the General Archive and the National Library in San Juan. who had received a generator from FEMA, like Jennifer said, the previous week, but the power was out that day when we arrived on Monday morning. We assessed the building and the collections using flashlights and headlamps. About 6 of the 16 areas we looked at were humid and warm, or had incipient mold activity, or were already moldy. That said, the building and the collections were well maintained. The photographic negative collection and the film collection had been moved to off-site locations and were in stable conditions based on what other experts determined prior to our arrival. Most of the storage areas were in fair climate condition and the holdings appeared to be stable. However, we saw possible active mold in 4 storage areas. In one of those areas, there was water intrusion primarily in the center aisle. So staff had to drape plastic sheeting over the shelving unit closest to the leak in order to protect the holdings, and place trash cans and buckets under the leak just to collect the dripping water. Those storage areas were warm, dark, and stagnant, which could provide the perfect conditions for the mold to thrive. We advised the staff to carry out the most extensive cleaning tasks when the power and appropriate climate were restored, but the power was not likely to be restored while we were there. So we wondered what else we could do to help them. During the tour of the spaces, we noted that the staff had the skills and abilities for caring for their collection. We were convinced that the best way to support the archive was by providing them with more information to control any detrimental situation in the future. The following day at the archive, we gave a training. We demonstrated routes of exposure and the types of personal protective equipment, commonly known as PPE. Nora did a demonstration on mixing an alcohol-based mold remediation solution that is appropriate for mold mitigation on historic furniture and books. We demonstrated how to put on full PPE and the vacuuming and spraying down of mold colonies with the mold remediation solution on an historic chair, while attendees watched behind glass doors. Vicky later demonstrated vacuuming mold books and individual sheets of paper. The staff was very interested and engaged, and many had inquiries that we were able to answer. Our initial recommendations were to keep circulating air and follow the guidelines we provided to clean the books and boxes in storage areas, and also the historic furniture on display and in common use areas. It was likely that other institutions had similar issues, such as damage to the building structures and the high risk of a mold outbreak and limited resources. So we consider giving another training later that week for the archive staff that couldn't attend that day, and perhaps a representative or two from other institutions under the Institute of Puerto Rican Cultures Management. The director of the Archivo, Dr. Samuel Quiñones, welcomed that idea with enthusiasm, and he was very gracious about it. Our third day, we met with a group of about 30 librarians at the Rio Piedras campus of the University of Puerto Rico. The whole team, along with Aurora Sotogras, director of the project's office from NEH, informed the group about support provided by FEMA, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and other grants available from organizations such as the Society of American Archivists and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. In addition to that, we discussed the reality of long-term recovery, the need to consider alternative options during that period, and we answered questions including how to effectively start response programs. During our talk, there was a power outage that lasted about an hour, so we had to do a demonstration on PPE using flashlights and headlamps, and the audience helped us using their phones to shine on us. Following our talk, we went to the Jose Lázaro Library, accompanied by the Rare Book Special Collections Librarian and the Arts Librarian to view their spaces. The roof at the library had damage that resulted in continual water infiltrations. The area with the Josefina del Toro Furlladosa Rare Book Collection had water coming under the walls, but no materials seemed to be damaged. They had humidifiers, and they were also able to open doors and windows, during the day to allow airflow. The Arts Library collection and the Zenobia and Juan Ramon Jimenez collection suffered continual water leakage from overhead, hence the need for draping stacks. Several books were water damaged, and some were beginning to show heavy mold growth. The walls and air conditioning ducts were heavily affected by mold. Other libraries, collections such as the Puerto Rican collection and the music library, had also been affected. Later that day, Diana, Vicky, and I went to the headquarters of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture in Old San Juan. We assessed the damage to the architectural drawing collection. The front door and the windows directly over some map files were damaged as a result of the hurricane onslaught. The collection of the architectural drawings in those files was completely soaked. Few staff members and volunteers had been effectively drying and sorting the drawings. They used preservation quality folders donated by the San Juan National Historic Site, to keep the drawing collections together, and later used some of the blotters we brought to assist with the drying. Diana answered questions about the registration and damage to the historic building, while Vicky and I discussed the need to keep circulating air in the room where the drawings were being stored. Meanwhile, Jennifer, Nora visited the Museum of Art of Puerto Rico to evaluate the spaces as an option for a possible training workshop. The museum's building received some significant damage to the exterior, and flash flooding the week prior this visit caused subsequent damage affecting the first and second floors. Wet books and the enormous crocheted lace main stage curtain depicted on the upper right were being dried on the tables. We gathered at the archive on Thursday for our second training. In this second session, about 22 persons attended, including staff from a variety of sites from the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture and librarians at the University of Puerto Rico. Diana, Nora, and I then headed over to the Luis Muñoz Marin Foundation to check out the spaces as a possible training site for another training session. Their collection was stable, and they also had no power during our visit, so they had to rely on a generator. Meanwhile, Jennifer and Vicky had gone early that morning out of the area metro to the National Guard at Camp Santiago. The collections had been stored in 3 tractor trailers, while a new addition to the building was being completed. The trailers were in good condition through Hurricane Maria, but were impacted by Hurricane Irma. One of the trailers had water intrusion, and part of the collection, primarily plaques, had to be laid out to dry. Another trailer had to be covered with a tarp, but no damage from water was observed. At the end of our 4th day, we all met at La Casa del Libro in Old San Juan. Their collection had been minimally impacted by Maria. However, the waterproofing membranes on the roof that were in perfect condition prior to the hurricane were severely damaged in some areas, one of them affecting right on the storage area. Their power was intermittent, and but they were able to use the humidifiers. On our last day, we went to the Museum of the Americas in Old San Juan. At that time, they lacked basic working conditions like power and water. And the heat was so extreme for long periods of time that staff could only work in the mornings. They had a lot of damage to the tile floors. Most of the display cases with doors were open to allow air circulation. However, some of the objects on display showed signs of mold growth, particularly those made out of organic materials. Only one of the cases that had an acrylic vitrine was unopened, and the wooden objects and feather headdress inside were visibly moldy. We recommended to have this case opened while wearing PPE, and that the objects be moved to a shaded but sunlit area with good air circulation to dry them down. The photo at the far right, which was captured in December, is evidence of the successful mitigation solution we offered in November. Lastly, we visited the National Gallery in Old San Juan, which is another museum managed by the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. They had a small water intrusion, which they had been cleaning every other day. They had a generator, so that their HVAC system was being used and it was working well. The generator ran from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening. And the storage area held an acceptable climate throughout the night. Overall, the institutions were experiencing a wide range of issues, but most of them would have a few things in common: intermittent power, dependency on gas fuel, and possible active mold. If not by then, it would have happened eventually. By the end of our first week, we had established new relationships with colleagues in Puerto Rico, offered our expertise and advice to preserve their collections, facilitated some supplies like PPE as well as materials for cleaning and rehousing damaged items, made recommendations for dealing with future emergency events, and informed about sources for funding. I will leave you now with Nora, who will talk more exhaustively about the environment and other factors influencing the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. I hope I don't exhaust you. I'm going to maybe fly through some of the mold pictures because you've seen a lot of those already, but let's go into it. So I'm here as an employee of the Smithsonian Institution, which, like my partners, is involved in the HENTEF collaborative. We are a quasi-federal institution, a trust instrumentality of the federal government, but we can put our federal hats on when we are requested to. So onward. This is, by the way, just the top couple of lines of what a mission assignment looks like. It's actually a big federal forum, which is not surprising, which commits resources towards a named disaster event. Again, so I'm actually conservator for the Smithsonian's own archives, and I was detailed by request under the aegis of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, an office within the Smithsonian that works nationally and internationally for disaster preparedness, recovery, and training in various cultural heritage crises. So you can find out more about them at that lovely little website. And I'll say there's a little line which is too small for you to see, but the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which has included members of NARA and members of National Park Service and NASA and Smithsonian, incorporates actually over 50 agencies. So that's who can apply to come work when called. As Bea explained, we did a lot of rapid site assessments. We did that via walkabouts and staff interviews, recording observations and comparing what we saw and perceived and were able to judge what the situation was, comparing that to reported incidents that when people had ability to communicate with us, but so many didn't because the phone lines were down. We're using a lot of alternative communication methods like mobile texts and personal phone numbers instead of official published office lines and what have you. When we were preparing to go down, we were doing a lot of phone call meetings and emergency coordination calls and trying to figure out what is the scale that we're facing. On a National Archives level, we can imagine a certain amount of scale, but when someone's servers are down, you can't exactly go online and find finding aids and find lists of holdings. And previously there were lots and lots and lots of lovely books that describe collections contents, but now in a digital age, it was hard for us to start thinking about, okay, where are we going to start? What are the importance? What are the priorities in this place? So a lot of that was established during interviews and talking and listening to our colleagues down there. So of course, we were there to report on the scale and types of damages, priorities and needs as they reported and we saw could be facilitated, and what resources were there to assist folks in recovering their collections. So, as we said, what was it like? About 60 to 90 days out, covering both periods when we went down, it was still hot and still really humid, not surprising. But I had actually not really ever been to the Caribbean, so I was kind of like, well, it'll get cooler and drier in the season, and people just looked at me. I'm like, have you been here before? And I said, no. So, it's hot outside, humid, and honestly lovely. A friend just came back from a weekend in Puerto Rico and said, come on down, it's wonderful out there. But these are not generally conditions that you're desirous to have within your collections facilities, right? And then what we were walking into, as was mentioned, generally dark with slippery, uneven surfaces from the amount of moisture uptake. And there's a lot of water uptake in most materials. And conservators and people who work with physical materials are used to organic materials swelling. I mean, your hair swells in the summertime, a newspaper in your garage gets limp. But also inorganic materials take up water from moisture intrusions. And that's how we had situations such as broken floors. A huge amount of water penetration can happen in tiles. That moisture expands, the adhesive expands and causes tension and hydrostatic pressure, and floors actually bust open. So we're going as disaster teams in with our little headlamps, but with our guides, with the people who know the collection area. It's a very important thing to mind one's safety when going and exploring. You want to see as many things as you can see in a day. But when you go into a dark area, you don't know where the stairwell is or what's broken or what's hanging between stacks. So careful walkarounds and documentation were very useful. And we actually made floor plan maps as we were going through when we couldn't get a floor plan from individuals, which mostly we were able to do. But again, taking time, you saw how many places we hit in just 5 days. So a bit about conditions. You might not be able to see the numbers in here, but let me assure you that they are numbers that conservators are not comfortable with. We're looking at 84 degrees at 70% humidity, 72, about 73% humidity. In one area, kind of cool, that's okay. But in the stacks, we're looking point-to-point measurement. These are conditions we're not comfortable with, right? 80 at 65, 67% relative humidity. And those are single data points, but we were able to use what is more useful, leaving some of these data loggers on site to gather some trend data over the day. And this is small for folks to see. This is just going to take you through 3 levels at the Archivo General and Biblioteca. And what we have is, so literally we're going up like 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors we'll go through, and you can see that there are crossing bars. Here we're about the same, like 68, 70, but right here when temperature and relative humidity cross, we get at something that some people might call dew point. That can happen. And so this is starting to think in my mind, I'm starting to see things like, okay, well, it's okay right now, but what if we kicked the air conditioning back on really, really fast? What would happen then if we suddenly dropped the temperature? There's a lot of advice coming in from a lot of places, so I'll lead up to what that means in a bit. And then here we have another one. We have higher up on the floor, we have our relative humidity dropping with our heat increasing, which is quite expected and normal. And just the next one, well, that's the 5th floor. There's a lot of heat load from the outside, and there's nothing cooling it, and there's some open windows, and you have a very high excessive temperature going on. And of course, with corresponding lower humidity, that's fine. But you have heat, and heat encourages heat and relative humidity together encourage the growth of mold and deterioration of organic material, and that's what we generally try to avoid in museums. You've seen this before. This is the university with constant and available water still dripping through penetration of the roof membrane and seal. Meanwhile, things are getting back a little bit to normal. The university is open, folks, when we are there. They are starting, people are in school. People need to be paid who are staff and coming in, and so they had opened for business while the library was closed, but librarians love them. I'm a card-carrying librarian. Librarians are out there providing reference services outside, under tents, just trying to figure out where people stand. Students are going in, well, I'm going to need this for my syllabus. They're trying to work with professors, saying professors are trying to figure out, well, where can I get my books? What are we going to do? How are we going to do this course? So people are trying to get back to normal. You can also understand that pressures are on the people who are supposed to open these buildings to say, why can't we open the buildings? What's wrong? And we're in there evaluating the potential health hazards that there are and potential collections hazards that there are at the same time. There are other locations that were not as tight buildings, things like buildings with historic fabric, as you saw in some areas, the reading room, but the National Archives, and this is elsewhere. But you also have not only the collections that are affected on the table, such as the books showing mold, but you also have historic fabric of a building. You have historic wooden furnishings. You have built-in bookcases. All these things have taken up moisture in this power outage in this time. The windows are open. That's not a usual case for an area that might have a ductless or retrofit climate control system. But in this case, at this point, when there is no power, maybe the outside is drier at different times of day. Certainly, the air circulation is going to help to dry things over time when there's been significant water ingress. Along the way, we did, as Bea noted, we made a couple of really fast flash mitigation recommendations for things that we could see were happening. I really cottoned to the if you see something, say something idea that was posted always up in the FEMA Joint Field Office. When you see something dangerous, try and address it and mitigate it. You might not have the best skills or the best tools to do it, but this right here is a part of built environment over on the left. Over on the left, there's a lovely door and stained glass assemblage, and you can see some stained glass on the floor. And there's actually a very, very distorted and broken stained glass input and inlay because the wood has swollen so much it's caused pressure on the metal. The metal has failed, the caning is bent, the glass is popping out. Should we shut that door? What should we do? Should we take out the glass? We also knew that coming in the next day was a troop of electricians coming to stabilize and take down the historic chandeliers to make sure that they were going to be okay. But how is that electrician going to come in there? And I guarantee you, they're coming in with a big old ladder, and they're not going to be really thinking about the glass. Meanwhile, this wooden door is swollen. It is, anybody who's got an old house knows that doors swell and stick in the winter. Well, this door was not going anywhere. So we're working with the house administrator, just went in and did like a field dressing. We were just thinking, we're a strike team here. We're just going to go in and do the best thing we can to sort of mitigate and sort of untorque that window a little bit without dropping out more glass, and just did a field dressing. And I was really thinking of the show MASH in my head. What can we do here to just help and allow people to realize they can start taking more actions that can help themselves and prevent more loss during this recovery period. So those were little things along the way that really, I think, helped build a lot of teamship between the travel team and the people who were there before, and they're going to be there after we left. Again, we did the workshops, but as was said by colleagues, we were having a lot of intermittent power issues, and we're wondering if we were really doing the right thing. What you don't see in that earlier picture is how dark it was. We were doing this by the open door because we could get a breeze going. We had a lot of people sitting around being very hot and very tired. Little tiny gas generators brought to power the vacuum that NARA had lent to come down there. And, we were able to do it, but was it the most effective training? Probably not. So this was part of, that's not probably not, but we knew we could do better. And we also realized we could do better with more collaboration and more partnership on phase 2. And so we'll be getting to that in a minute. So just for those in the audience who might not be completely versed in control of museum environments, an ideal museum environment is a stable climate, okay? It's ideally cooler and drier than your outdoor weather. And when it's power dependent, because not all are, some are anthropological sites outdoors, when there's power dependency, ideally it's a continuous and controllable power source, and knowledgeable staff make their best practice decisions based on their museum education or their practical common sense knowledge. But in a recovery environment, you're in a new normal, and for people to actually have to get out of what they were trained to do and to understand that they can be more flexible in making those decisions was part of what we were encountering down there. And it's actually been very instructive for us as professionals and disaster recovery professionals to realize you have to start thinking a little differently, you can let go, and you can make the best decision you can at the time. So in the 60 to 90 day out environment, the weather environment is stabilizing, but it's wetter and warmer than your ideal. There's no power and you have a really, really tight building. That tight building might not be serving your collections as well as they were before. There's no air circulation. When you have a possibility of creating air circulation, that is better than no air circulation at all, okay? The collections themselves, as I've shown you, have a new moisture equilibrium. They've taken up a lot of moisture, so the conditions inside are now very different than your ideal museum climate. And during a period in which you have inconsistent or interrupted power supply, you're frequently rebooting your systems. Older systems may come online right away. Newer systems, as I've experienced, sometimes have a fail-safe shutdown mode and they have to go through a whole startup. Anyone who has built and commissioned a climate system for collections knows that it's sensitive, and ideally we work it out for 2 weeks to 30 days until we bring our collections in there. Right now you're dealing with collections in a space and recommissioning a system every 24, every 48 hours, 30 days, 60 days, and what's that balance gonna be like? So there's stress on people, there's stress on objects, and there's stress on systems, both mechanical and practical infrastructure. And so we're hoping to educate that knowledgeable staff need to start making risk-based and prioritized decisions based on the actual system at hand, what's going on right now, not what your ideal was, but what is going on in your site today, and what are your priorities, and how can you deal with them. And to that, we lean on a lot of resources. I'm not sure if you can see that lower line from back here. The contrast is a little funny, but I will read at the last bullet, is that most of our written recovery guidance tends to be short-term. There's a lot of documentation that says in the first 48 hours, the first 72 hours, there's a mold recovery window. You've got to get in there. You've got to get things out. You've got to evacuate. You've got to bring in those freezer trucks. And what am I hearing there? We're 60 to 90 days out, and there's still no power. And there aren't a lot of freezer trucks, and there aren't a lot of generators. So how do we think and react and recover differently? Moving forward. This is a very dark slide on the left of a mechanical unit, a big old mechanical unit to which I finally tracked down the monitor, the power regulator, and it's got a certain amount of power in it, enough to do a readout. That's probably a fail-safe emergency generator running this with no current going through the system. But what do you want that system to start up as, if you're even there when it starts up? Do you want it to go full blast back, like shooting out 62-degree air and trying to dry everything down all at once? A lot of advice is get it cold as fast as you can, cool it and dry it, go fast, 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 go hard. And I don't actually, this is my personal opinion as a conservator, I don't think that is an approach that we should always be taking. Now I'm gonna go forward a little bit in time. I knew that meanwhile talks were underway within the Smithsonian past the point of the expiration of the FEMA mission assignment, that the Smithsonian was planning on going down to work with one of our affiliates. We have affiliate museums in all over, and 3 in Puerto Rico. And we were in talks with them already to do a disaster workshop. And we had great communication from the museum, Museo del Arte de Puerto Rico, which is our affiliate host for these workshops. And what I saw and what my colleagues saw and helped document for me is the fact that I think we needed new educational material for this course that had been run already, I think 2 or 3 times. And so I came up with a very, like a our course, a little short course, but understanding and managing the museum environment in recovery. And mostly to take pressure off of people to think like, it's got to be this way, it's got to be this cool, it's got to be this dry. It's like, well, this is how to talk to your facility manager about what your goals are. This is understanding what a building envelope is. This is about mitigating the ingress of water and around your building to reduce load on your systems and to know what your system can actually do for you. This is a quick little matrix I came up with to ask people in that course to evaluate where were they right now. There was some Q&A going on in the upper left in the green. Do you have a continuous source of power? Do you have planned intermittent shutdowns? Because some people do that to save on diesel gas and generation, and that's perfectly acceptable. But do you know, are you kind of getting back to stable? Or do you have an interrupted source of power? Are you diesel generator dependent completely? What's going on? And just recently in April, there was a down power line over the whole island for 24, 48 hours at least. So, maybe everybody's still a little bit in the yellow zone. If the site usually has power and maintains engineering controls, do you have power? No? Okay, well, what else can you do then? What can you do when you do not have power to mitigate risks in your collections? And anyone can be in the sort of blue to orange zone, which is, do you have still continuing building impact? Do you not have a sealed roof membrane? Do you have open windows? Do you have water ingress from below, or are you at risk in the next hurricane? So that's to help people understand it's not done. There's goalposts to go for in recovery, and where are you in your recovery? You may not be like your museum neighbor, and you may have different priorities based on the contents of your collection. Jumping back to when I was still with the travel team, as Bea led into, and I will lead out, part of our risk assessment as a team was, were we doing enough? Could we do enough? We were doing workshop demonstrations, and that was great, but our expertise as conservators and subject matter experts could go a little bit further across island for phase 2, and we could probably be enabled to do more if we could bring in someone for the health and safety portion that we were addressing with skill, but there are people better skilled at it. So that's where we brought in our friends from NIOSH and the CDC. And I will leave it to Abigail to talk it out. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about our second week. Week 2, the buddy system makes it mission possible. In December of 2017, I was given the opportunity to join Beatrice, Nora, and Vicky on their second deployment to Puerto Rico. During our 5 days on the ground, we visited 7 museums and historic houses and taught 3 full-day courses to a total of 84 local cultural heritage professionals. I want to talk through each day of our trip, covering both what we accomplished and what we learned, and a little bit about what ESF 11 taught me about the buddy system. The team for the second deployment included Beatrice, Nora, and Vicky from the November trip, joined by me, Donnie from the CDC, and Elizabeth from NPS. As this was my first deployment as a heritage emergency responder, I was unsure what my role would be and what role our team would have within emergency support function number 11. For help, I went straight to the description of what ES11 is. As you can see, its purpose is to protect a broad range of resources, including defending the supply of processed egg products, which is definitely not my area of expertise. But our mission and technical specialty is covered in the last clause of the first paragraph, ensuring the protection of natural and cultural resources and historic properties. That we could do. That would be a possible mission for us. And within that role, the December mission would focus on those activities that would help Puerto Rico's cultural institutions with long-term recovery. We would provide training and emergency response to as many cultural heritage professionals as we could reach. In turn, they would be able to share and spread what they learned from us, increasing not only the island's ability to mitigate the effects of Irma and Maria, but also its overall readiness for the next disaster affecting cultural heritage. With that mission in mind, we set off. After arrival in San Juan, we checked in at the JFO, you've heard mentioned, at the convention center. There at the Joint Field Office, we planned our billeting for the week, arranging to stay at FEMA contracted hotels around the island while we traveled to our training destinations. When we went to our cabins on La Suprema, the docked Italian ferry boat Beatrice showed you, which served as our home base for the nights we were in San Juan. I'm so grateful I was with Vicky and Beatrice because they had experience navigating the FEMA system. As you saw in Jennifer's presentation, the JFO is a large operation, and knowing and being able to find your points of contact is critical. The following day, the work of the trip really began with a site visit to the National Archives, which you've heard mentioned before. Vicki, Beatrice, and Nora had already worked closely with the archives in November. This visit gave me, Donnie, and Elizabeth a chance to meet the staff and see the damage to the buildings and collections. While looking at damp and dark collection storage areas, moldy records, and physically damaged buildings, something else we were always doing was listening. Back in November, Vicki was one of the instructors in the hands-on salvage training and workshop given here at the archives. I remembered her saying that when deployed, it is important to listen to your professional contacts' personal stories of the disaster, sometimes more than once, because people are still processing what had happened to them. The collections had suffered, but the collective trauma was, of course, larger than that and still raw. This was advice I was glad to have heard. Dr. Samuel Quinones, who you've seen a couple of times so far, the director of the archives, is pictured on the left talking with Elizabeth in the white shirt there. He told me that what it was like to experience the power of Hurricane Maria from his apartment on a high floor in his building. It went on for hours and hours, the building swaying. The penthouse apartment was blown off of his building completely. When the storm passed, Samuel focused on coming back to work to salvage his collections, like so many people we met on the trip. In the afternoon, we went to La Casa del Libro in historic Old San Juan, where roof leaks had led to extensive growth of mold colonies. Elizabeth's experience with historic buildings was invaluable as we went up to the roof to look for possible areas of water ingress. In discussions with staff, we learned that the building was actually two buildings joined together, and where the buildings joined is where water leaks often occurred. We had a good discussion about unsympathetic methods and materials sometimes used in modern repairs to old buildings, and Elizabeth provided alternatives they could use in the future. On day 2, we drove to Mayaguez on the west coast of the island. There, we taught our first day-long training session. Each member of the team taught in their specialty. Vicki covered the principles of the emergency response cycle. Nora discussed emergency care of paper and books. Elizabeth covered the complexities of working with historic buildings. I talked about handling and cleaning damaged objects. And in what came to be the highlight of each session, Donnie addressed how to work safely in the aftermath of a natural disaster, especially around mold. He led demonstrations of donning, that is putting on, and doffing, or taking off, appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE. We demonstrated dressing in a full Tyvek suit, as you see Nora on the left there, with gloves, goggles, and an N95 particulate mask, or half-face respirator for working with chemicals. On the right, Nora is wearing a lighter duty combination of Tyvek apron and sleeves with an N95 mask and nitrile gloves. You can see from the close way the students watched, this is information they wanted to learn and needed in order to work safely with their damaged collections. In Mayaguez, our hosts were unbelievably gracious and kind, offering us gifts of local coffee and cake, taking us to a fantastic spot for lunch. And as we drank coffee, as we walked to lunch, we listened to their stories and learned more about what Maria meant to them and to their families. In the classroom, when we took breaks, attendees connected with each other, learning from the experiences of other museums, archives, and libraries, and just catching up with friends and colleagues they might not have seen since the hurricanes. In the middle, you will see part of the sign-up sheet for our class showing the range of institutions our students represented. At the end of the day, we packed into the van, ready to do it all again tomorrow. Our third day was spent in Ponce at the magnificent Ponce Museum of Art. It really is a beautiful building. It had suffered very little hurricane damage and maintained power with the help of a generator, so they were able to host us and many colleagues from more damaged locations for a day of training. Here, Nora shows both the English and Spanish versions of the emergency response and salvage wheel. We also were able to give out a lot of salvage wheels while we were there. We also demonstrated PPE, of course. Here I am, taping Nora's sleeves into her nitrile gloves, which prevents liquids like water or solvents from reaching her arms. At all times, Beatrice translated, and translated. We were also able to tour the museum's conservation labs, talking to their staff about the projects they were working on. Every day brought more opportunities to listen and learn. One thing we did at the end of each training class was provide students with a bag containing many of the PPE and cleaning materials we had demonstrated. We brought with us, as you saw from Beatrice's slide of the suitcase packed, we brought with us a full range of glove sizes and several types and brands of N95 masks. Locally, we purchased cosmetic sponges, which are used to gently remove mold from stable surfaces, and cotton pads used to wipe cloth book covers with a 70% solution of alcohol to help dry out mold spores and keep them dormant. Ponce also provided another opportunity for a delicious Puerto Rican meal at lunch, and there we were able to talk more with the museum's staff, and on the way, walk through a local neighborhood still in the midst of cleanup, as you can see. At the end of another productive and rewarding day, we all paused to look at Sir Frederick Leighton's painting, Flaming June. On the fourth day, we returned to San Juan to teach at the Museum of Art, Puerto Rico. Again, our students came from across the island from a wide range of cultural heritage institutions. The conservation labs at the museum provided a great venue to demonstrate safe mold remediation techniques, including removing dry mold with a HEPA-filtered vacuum. We also discussed strategies needed at this stage of the cleanup efforts the students found themselves managing. We talked about finding supplies, securing government funding, applying for available grants, and trying to get buy-in from their home institutions to develop more comprehensive emergency plans for the future. Day five was an epic day. We started off the morning in Humacao on the East Coast at Casa Roig, and you've seen some pictures of this site before. It's the former house of a sugar plantation owner, built in the prairie style in 1920. It was listed on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places in 1977. In the house and the adjacent museum building, we saw damage to both the building structures and its contents. On the left is an image of frass left behind by a local insect that usually does not cause this type of damage indoors. However, when Hurricane Maria caused a widespread defoliation of the island's trees, the insects came inside to look for food, in this case, a wooden door frame. On the right is an image of a desk original to the house. It was too large to move out of the house before the storm, but the staff had carefully protected it in place with plastic sheeting. It had not received any water damage. However, without power to air condition the house for 3 months, the high humidity was causing new active corrosion on the copper alloy hardware, which previously had a smooth patina of use. Upstairs, we documented some of the most dramatic damage we saw on this trip. I shadowed our team's historic architect, Elizabeth, as she looked at the damage to ceilings, doors, and the roof. The mold was extensive on the ceiling and walls, as you can see from the second image. We all wore masks inside the house, and it was a good experience for me to really feel what I had been describing to our course attendees. Working in proper PPE in a hot environment is hard work. You sweat, you get thirsty, you have to take breaks, and working in teams with a buddy really does help keep you safe. In the early afternoon, Beatrice, Elizabeth, and I traveled outside of the city to the herbarium of the Botanical Gardens. As I've mentioned, what we found at each site were passionate professionals in charge of world-class collections, and they took their duties to care for their heritage seriously. In the image on the left, Eugenio Santiago, the curator of the herbarium at the Botanical Gardens, shows us his most important collection, the type specimens, the specimens that document the discovery of a new plant on the island. The very first thing he did when he could leave his house safely after Hurricane Maria passed was come to the herbarium to check on his collections, to see if there was power, and to monitor the temperature and humidity levels. He is definitely a man after my own preventive conservation heart. In the afternoon, we met up with Vicki and Nora at the Museum of the Americas in Old San Juan. While they were filming an interview for FEMA, we explored the galleries, which had been without sufficient power since the hurricanes. Corrosion had begun to form on metal surfaces like this suit of armor, and the tile, as we've mentioned before, in the external hallways was lifting in large bubbled sections, then exploding under the pressure, sending tile shards flying. Elizabeth spoke to the museum staff about possible causes and mitigation strategies. This image was taken in one of the museum's galleries displaying art created in Maria's aftermath. The painting is a local artist post-Maria take on Picasso's Guernica. In December, we were seeing Puerto Rico in recovery. While we were there, the island was officially declared open for tourism. However, while most cultural institutions had power, some only from backup generators, most of the staff we spoke to still did not have power at home. Hurricane Maria was 3 months in the past, but many people on the island were still living through it. As we traveled from San Juan to Mayaguez to Ponce, teaching heritage emergency response techniques, we demonstrated the literal buddy system, using a partner to make sure you safely put on and take off your personal protective equipment. In a larger sense, we also worked as a team, buddying up to help each other. After watching Donnie and Nora correctly demonstrating putting on personal protective equipment, I could then demonstrate with Nora. Like I learned the ropes of FEMA from Vicki and Bea, we learned from those with more experience, then taught those who wanted to learn from us. We also documented each of our sessions, taking notes on what we all said. When we returned, I typed up many pages of training notes, and as a group, our deployment team edited and added to the notes until we came up with the compiled written curriculum for our course. The talented and tireless Beatrice translated the whole document into Spanish, and both versions were sent back to those who attended our sessions. We have encouraged attendees to feel empowered to teach the content to their colleagues. We hope the knowledge continues to spread. I also want to share our knowledge and experience with more colleagues and supporters like you to build the National Archives capacity for response. These ESF 11 missions provide important connections, a buddy system, so that our cultural heritage colleagues recovering from a disaster do not have to do it alone. After our training class in Mayaguez, one attendee thanked me and the team for coming to Puerto Rico and for sharing what we knew. "You're the only ones who've come," he said. I can't thank my emergency response colleagues and my managers at the National Archives enough for the opportunity to serve, to be there for him and for so many others. Among the things I will remember are connecting with our team over great meals, eating lots of plantains, meeting kind and funny colleagues around Puerto Rico, appreciating the real beauty of where we were, and being so grateful for the chance to help recovery efforts around the island. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to wrap up our Puerto Rico portion. My mission, my team, my role on the team, that's what I'm trying to say, was as the leader, but these folks didn't need a whole lot of leading. It was really wonderful to work with everybody on the team. What we found, as everyone has said, were very dedicated and knowledgeable professionals in Puerto Rico who had just been overwhelmed, and as Abigail said, no one there was returning home to a place where things were the way they were before a hurricane hit. Everyone had no power. Everyone had no water. the things that we all did this morning when we got out of bed, they couldn't do, and they still went to work. And they were lovely, genuine professionals who were very eager at all times to hear what we had to say and to tell us their story. I'm just going to go through. These are different professionals: the Museum of the Americas, MAPPER, the Museum of Puerto Rico in San Juan, the library, and then what we got to see of the National Guard Museum, which was the inside of those trailers that Jennifer talked about at the beginning. Very knowledgeable professionals with amazing collections who would tell you the story of the desk in their office, or the print, or the page of a book. And we tried to collaborate with them as much as possible. The team was a collaboration between all the different agencies, but then as we moved around Puerto Rico, we collaborated with all of the people. None of us are paintings conservators, and yet we were looking and giving advice and listening to the changes, to the librarian tell us about the changes they were seeing due to the lack of HVAC. We were looking in ceiling tiles, and you see Beatrice helping to show the collections manager there at the Casa Roig about unframing an article. The glass had shattered across the front of this print, and so she didn't know how to handle it, and we did. So Bea was giving her a quick lesson in that. We dropped off supplies. You see myself and one of the people from the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture at the headquarters where they needed extra blotter, which luckily on our second trip had arrived by then, and so we could take them blotter paper for them to use with those building plans. And again, more collaboration, listening to stories, donning and doffing our PPE properly, and just enjoying the collections that they had there and trying to tell people how they could mitigate the disaster that had fallen them. There were, as you see here from the slides from our various trainings, there were sort of impromptu trainings where we scrounged the day before to find the chemicals we needed, and we shuffled PPE and found ways to demonstrate in the middle of an open door hallway with the generator sitting outside the door so none of us had the toxic fumes to breathe, to these very nice locations on our second trip with light and power and coordinating with a variety of different museum professionals. I think our trainings went well. These are congratulatory notes that we got after we got back home from our deployment after our trainings. Thanks, many thanks from the various participants of our training sessions, which made us all feel really good. And then there's the crazy improvisation of emergency work where you don't want to put things outside in your sunny patio, so you dry things in the hallway of your museum, as you did at the ECP. There's our door mitigation from a very handy cardboard box and some tape to try to tame that wild piece of metal that was hanging off the door and sure to get knocked off by that large ladder, because honestly, Nora's not exaggerating, the door could not be moved. It wasn't going anywhere. We didn't have a screwdriver with us until, of course, we found Donnie, who was on the first floor in the other building, but we found a penny, so that was part of the demonstration of how to disassemble a frame. Somebody had a penny in their pocket. We could work the screws with that. And Nora and Abigail demonstrating what a cart looks like and how to operate it. So, and how to move your materials from one area of your museum to another. It was a great demo. We also did books on a shelf, which we did in the dark. just again, the beauty of Puerto Rico, the wonderful collections that you found everywhere we went. The illuminated manuscript is from not the Casa del Libro, although they had a number of them. This is from the National Biblioteca, Flaming June, of course, the Casa Roig from the outside, and collections from that art, the art collection at the University of Puerto Rico, the Rio Piedras campus. And then collaboration and friendship that happens. One of the wonderful things that happened in our first trip was because of the lack of any kind of power down in San Juan, the people at the ICP, the Institute for Puerto Rican Culture, there were no subway, the subway, you can only go to Subway so many days in a row, and apparently the pizza place had lost its charm, and that sort of covered everything that first week that we were there. So they told us that they had started cooking collectively together. They would bring things that they had, collect money from each other. Some people were better cooks, so they could take the hour off before lunch to get lunch ready for everyone at the Institute. And we actually happened to be there right before Thanksgiving, so we had Puerto Rican Thanksgiving with the staff of the ECP, which was wonderful. And we all learned to work together, and I lived our 3 thumbs up for our door work there. That was very good. But it is all about collaboration and teamwork and the buddy system. So on the left, you see the first team, and our team member who was secretly working at La Suprema in the kitchen. He was very nice, and the few times that we showed up really late and dinner was almost gone, he would always scrounge things for us from the kitchen so we could have some dinner when we returned to the ship. And then all the rest are candid shots of the rest of the team, of the second team. We did eat a lot of plantains. I did have a pigeon on my head. Things happen. So I just wanted to thank everyone in Puerto Rico for the opportunity, thank our bosses. I did want to read one of our letters because people had asked us to talk about the aftermath and how things are now. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from a letter that was received by Karen Cana Cruz, the executive director at the Casa del Libro. She writes, Casa del Libro is going through many processes. The damage caused to the building by hurricanes has not yet been repaired. The envelope which protects the collection suffered the most. The roof membrane is peeled by the wind and broken in some parts. FEMA did a damage evaluation for the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, owner of the building. Other situations, such as cleaning the mold and the air conditioning ducts, repairing the bird netting, because that's where I ended up with the pigeon on my head, painting the building and fixing the doors, among others, are waiting FEMA approval of our public assistance request, still under review. Until we get a permanent solution to these damages, we prepare for the next hurricane season. To protect the building and collections as much as possible, we will place tarps over the largest leaks. Thanks to the emergency grant rewarded by the NEH, we have a generator that should be installed and hope to be ready by June 30th, 2018. They were recently visited by conservators Susan Duell and mechanical systems expert specialist, I suppose, Jeremy Linden, thanks to a grant obtained through the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation to carry out a CAP assessment. It's a conservation assessment. While they work on the report, we are starting to implement the strategies discussed with them. These offer us the opportunity to, in the short term, prepare ourselves better for future climatological events. And for the medium and long term, give us the opportunity to organize ourselves to receive the remainder of the collection stored in an external deposit, refine the general operations of the Institute, and direct us toward the adequate preparation for the main deposits. We are passionate about what we do and continue to offer services to all of our publics, researchers, school children, and the general public so that culture prevails. However, we now have more work, we are delayed, and we have less income. Enter the fight mode. The positive outcome is the collection is stable. We have established and strengthened ties with colleagues, wonderful professionals, both locally and from the mainland, and we have a clear north. We have had the privilege of supporting other entities, so in spite of all the misfortune, we feel good and we are grateful. Hope that with our effort, the support of all of you, that all of you are bringing us, and the help of the universe, we go forward. Thank you. If Preston is ready,
That's Preston's here. Can you hear me?
yes.
Great. Okay, sorry I can't be with you in person today, but we'll have to do this via phone. Apologies. But I do have a few slides. I'll go pretty quick. And in the interest of time here. What you've been hearing about, of course, has been about Puerto Rico. And the same disasters that happened to Puerto Rico, I think, as Jennifer mentioned in the very beginning, happened also to the Virgin Islands. Irma and Maria were very devastating there, and very similar to the kinds of things that you've been seeing happened also in the Virgin Islands. The geography is very close. You're only talking about, at its closest point, 40 miles or so between the Virgin Islands and the eastern part of Puerto Rico. Kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. Vicki, I think you're going to be operating the slides. Would you go to the next slide, please, which is the one about the text describing the mission assignment.
Okay.
I just wanted to acknowledge the team for the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the team was made up of 2 Smithsonian Institution conservators. That's Katie Wagner, who is a paper conservator, and Ashley Yaley, who is she's also a Smithsonian, who is an objects conservator, and then, of course, myself representing archives and records management. I wear 2 hats. The mission assignment was just for the 2 weeks. It was for an initial assignment, or assessment rather, and that was in March. And the mission was focused on conducting damage assessments to permanent and historical records and important artifacts and objects on all 3 islands. We're talking about St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And no training component like the workshops that was mentioned in Puerto Rico. We did not do that in the Virgin Islands. We were just focused on damage assessments. We did 27 damage assessments on all 3 islands. And that was very aggressive. That was very busy. So what we were doing is we were determining the damage to the records and the objects, and then coming up with plans of action for how to recover, and the all-important rough cost estimates to recover the records and objects. That was a big part of what we were doing. That was very important to FEMA. And then also we were to do recommendations for future mission assignments if they are to occur in the Virgin Islands, and we did do that. Next slide, please. All right, this should be the slide of Katie on the right and myself. We're in full protective gear here, the PPE that you heard about before. We used it in the Virgin Islands, of course. It's crucial for safety. You have to have the PPE. Very damaged areas, lots of mold. And in this particular case, we're going through these leather-bound books, and we're assessing mold and water damage to some of the early in the sense of U.S. Virgin Islands and their modern records. These are Danish language journals, or at least one of the books, the one I have in my hand there is. And what that means is that's pre-1917. Danish West Indies went up to 1917, and then that was transferred to the United States at that time, and then it became known as the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. All right, and this one, then you see the same book, and you can see a close-up here of the journal showing some of the damage from the water and the subsequent mold growth on the pages. And it's very hard to recover information from damage such as this, since the inks have blended in with the mold. And it looks like some sort of psychiatric test or something like that with the big blobs of ink there. But with no indentation of the handwriting, you probably lost the information on that page. Next slide, please. All right, so here on the left-hand side, that photo is the Virgin Island team suited up in our PPE gear. And we're preparing to go into a historic site into the capital city of Charlotte Amalie on St. Thomas. On the right-hand side are leather-bound volumes with lots of mold. And if you look closely at it, you'll notice they're sitting on top of particle board shelving. Particle board shelving in a very humid environment is not good. The results are not going to be favorable. Records tend to stick to it, and whether it be boxes or whether it be leather-bound books. And that's indeed what happened at this location. However, I would say that most locations did a pretty good job in preparing for hurricanes. They know the protocol, they know what to do, and they cover the records in plastic for the most part, and they get them up off the floor for the most part. And they sometimes had shelves against exterior walls. And when that happens, the moisture goes through the wall and gets into the records. We saw some of that happening. And also sometimes they would put records on the bottom shelves. So if you have water surge or just a leaky building from the hurricane and all the rain, then they were subject to damage as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so not all the records and all of our assessments were for paper records. We also had objects. And here you see Ashley Yaley, who, again, specializes in conservation of objects. And she's assessing damage to an art and artifacts collection on St. Thomas. This was one of our worst hit areas. And many of the historic objects were made of wood or fabric. But very similar to what we would have with analog records or paper records, you're going to have mold and just all kinds of damage on those, and that's what she experienced there as well. Next slide, please. All right, I call this the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this, by the way, is the last area that we visited. This is on the island of St. Croix. This is before we left the Virgin Islands. And here, this is a historic plantation, and we found a very well-organized archives where you had acid-free folders, acid-free boxes, shelf lists as well identified and labeled, environmental controls when you had power or auxiliary generators, and had proper lighting, and even modern movable shelving. So it was very nice to see that. And that area did not really suffer damage, and that was very nice to see. The photo in the middle, however, is of a framed map. That was not in the archives that you see on the left. It was outside that area, and it was stored with some furniture nearby. And it was covered top to bottom with extensive mold. That was a map of the Caribbean. And it's hard to tell that that's even a map under there. So that one's going to be a tough job to recover. Can be done, but it's going to take a bit of doing. The staff did open the door to the side of the stack area just to, knowing that we were going to be working in the area, they wanted us to have some fresh air and plus just to air out that space. Unfortunately, that allows iguanas to come into the space, and we had an iguana in that stack area. And actually, on this mission, we had 2 different places where we had iguanas in stacks. So that's kind of something I don't think my Smithsonian colleagues or myself or NARA had seen elsewhere. We've seen all kinds of vermin, but big iguanas was not something we expected. But it overall, you know, we had some areas that had little damage. We had a lot that were moderate in the middle, and then a few that were severely damaged of the 27 places that we saw. More work to be done there, though. And in the interest of time, I know we're over. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Shannon or Vicki for closure on this session and see if we can entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Preston.
I don't know if anyone in the audience has any questions. If anyone online has any questions, you can type it into the dialog box that's located next, just right to the picture screen. If you have a question that you would like to type in or send later, you can use the email address that you contacted to get the web link, and we can answer your question later. I don't know if there's any questions on the phone.
Oh, there's a question here in the audience.
Oh, great.
Yes?
I've done some work in Puerto, I do work in Puerto Rico research, and use the archivo general quite a bit. I've had conversations with
Oh. Could you? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see the microphone just to the side?
Yes. Thank you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I do research in Puerto Rico, and I've had contact with Beatriz and Nora and Vicki, right, previously about this. But my question is about the Archivo General, which I've worked at a lot. You mentioned, was it Beatriz mentioned the film archive, some of the film canisters had condensation? Is that what, someone had mentioned that? Was that Jennifer? Yeah, and I wanted to know, I know that, I think I talked to Nora about this, and I heard that there were some private donors or private individuals who helped support off-site storage facilities for some of the film archives. Is that correct? And I wanted to know, I guess my question is a bigger question too, is about private individuals, collectors, philanthropists, and others who are sort of stepping up to the plate, you know, to sort of help the effort with off-site facilities. Yeah.
Turn it off. You turned it off.
It's a very good question. I want to mention at the very beginning, when we were getting the supplies ready, there were like 20 people on the phone. And what was the name of the organization that donated money to help us buy supplies? Do you remember? It was the company, the guys you buy the catalogs from, Gaylord. Gaylord actually contributed money to help buy supplies that were being shipped to the islands. Part of the film collection was actually off-site, being already stored off-site.
In preparation for the?
No,
No.
it just happened to be a separate location. There was a panic. I will admit that one should not believe everything you see on the media. There was a panic among conservators who had seen a film that I don't know who filmed while I was there, of the film's condition with the condensation on the outside of the tins. It was, I have no idea when that picture was taken because that was not the condition we had, though that was my highest priority at the very beginning, was to get the film's condition, so the first generator I had went to the films. At least during my time there, the folks who stepped up was the Smithsonian and then the National Endowment for the Humanities had a representative showing people how to seek grants. As to private individuals, we did not see that happening. The greatest concern we had was for the artists and the artists' own collections. We had several artists whose homes and studios were devastated. And while I was there in Puerto Rico, I started trying to get large corporations to try to donate money and support, but initially to no avail. So I did not know of anyone who, maybe you guys have heard, but I did not hear of people stepping up and.
I see. Yeah, I think that storage facility that already previously existed for the films, that was, I think that's privately endowed or privately supported, but that, again, is previous to the.
Maybe.
That's what I'd heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
There was, is this,
Yeah, yours is on.
oh, you here? Oh, cool. There was a survey already underway of those conditions that was funded by another group or another couple of groups. And so that's where that was. It wasn't, one single donor.
I see. I see.
But I have to say also that with museums that are institutions with boards, it's time, they have friends who enjoy the museum and have benefits of the museum, and they are also called to support in a time of need such as that. So contributions may be coming in from that, whether that's in kind, providing material and support, or getting word out can be very useful.
Thank you for your work.
You're welcome. I was going to say there was a group besides the National Heritage Responders who come through the Foundation for the American Institute of Conservation, so many letters, and the heart training that was provided. There was also another group called SURF Plus. It's Craft Emergency Relief Fund, and they were doing some work with artists as opposed to doing it with institutions. They were providing some training to artists on how to take care of their own works.
And since then, the foundation of the Society for American Archivists Disaster Recovery Fund, which is made up of little tiny $5 and much larger contributions from archivists and people who care, has actually granted out at least 5 of their disaster recovery grants this year were made to Puerto Rico. Based on some of the really hard work people were doing, writing those grants and just documenting their situations and getting those out there. So that's out of the pockets of individual people like you.
Yeah, and I was going to say, we did provide reports to every institution that we went to, providing suggestions, what they would need to go forward. And I know some of the different institutions did include them in their grants and in applications and things like that as conservation quality reports for assessments and for need.
So we are a bit over time right now, so I would just like to thank all of our presenters for giving us so much great information, and thank everyone for coming to the talk in person and also on the web, and anyone listening on the phone, of course. And please feel free to contact us in the future if you have any more questions or comments in regards to this talk. So thank you very much, everybody.